Welcome to the Stories Told podcast, where we share stories from everyday people making a positive impact, big or small. Our mission, to shape a better future by telling better stories. Welcome to episode 1 of the Stories Told podcast. As you would have heard from that little intro, the idea of this whole podcast is for me to be able to share the stories of the people that I get to meet through this new venture. Already there have been some really incredible people that I've spoken to, and stories that will be launched over the coming weeks. And I'm really excited to be able to take the incredible things that they're doing to communities that need to hear them. And that's the whole idea behind Stories Told, is to uncover and unearth those humans who are doing really, really incredible things, and to take their stories to a platform where people can hear them. And so a bit of good news, I think, is what everyone needs. And the people that I've met already, and the people I hope to meet, over the coming months and years, I can't wait to share their stories. But before I get into those styles of podcasts and start sharing their stories, it's probably important, I thought, that you knew my story and how Stories Told came to be. And a big part of my story in the last few years, well, for the last 15 years, we've been best mates, but particularly in the last few years since we've been living together, and he's seen me go through this journey, is my best mate Jim, and I thought it'd be fitting that he be on the first episode of the podcast.
Hopefully the best episode as well. Thanks for having me on, man. It's really exciting. It's been really cool to see the evolution of the idea, from the get-go and where it's come to. And I love the idea of putting it out in longer form, or putting stories out in longer form medium, like a podcast, and as well as the videos. I think that's really powerful. So I'm pumped to be on here.
Yeah, and I think it was actually yourself that introduced me to this book that I'm going to talk about, New Old Way, which was written by Frank Forensic, and you sort of said you need to read this book probably 6 to 12 months ago, and
then gave it to you for your birthday.
Yeah, exactly. and ever since reading that, I mean, the wheels were already in motion, but I think a lot of what he had to say resonated with me and cleared up or redefined my perspective on storytelling, and the power that it can have, and with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that's a big thing that I sort of learnt through reading what he had to say. And I love his definition, and I think that's a good way to start this podcast, is to define what storytelling is. And he says story is the sculptor of human life, health and spirit. One way or another, we're always involved in the process. We may not think of ourselves as storytellers, but we're creating constantly, telling stories to ourselves or others. Every gesture, every word, every decision, every action, it all creates story, and we're under the influence every minute of every day. And I think that really sums up, I think people probably look at story or think of stories as what they see on the news or what they read in books, but it really is everything that we say and everything we're communicating to each other every day. We're telling stories, and if we all think of it in that perspective, I think that puts it into perspective how powerful it is and how important it is to make sure we're telling the right stories.
100%. And the more we've talked about it lately, the more I've realized how relevant that is, how relevant the concept of story is in the things that I've done with physio and the things we're doing with TFC, which we can touch on later. But it's resonating more and more. And Frank he really does a good job of explaining it.
Yeah, he really, really does. And if you haven't read that book, I recommend everyone listening to go get a copy and give it a read. The chapter on story is right towards the end, and it's a really good,
very powerful book.
Yeah, very, very powerful. And he does talk about in that book, I mean, the birth of story, I suppose, in human evolution, and it would have been, he wasn't there, and we don't know for sure, but it would have been with those ancestral tribes, those ancient tribes, the hunters, the gatherers, and those people coming back from from the hunt and sitting around the campfire, and one day someone started telling a story, and that communication of what they'd experienced, and it would have had people captivated. It would have had people, transfixed, and it would have moved younger members of the tribe to then think, oh, wow, how inspiring is that? I can't wait to go out and experience it myself. And, I think that really has shaped, if you think of it from that very, very beginning, it really has shaped the cultures that we now live in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when it starts off like that, and then different stories turns into mythologies and eventually religions and things like that, and it just makes so much sense that story is a huge part of how humans have connected all throughout history.
Yeah, and I love this quote from Yuval Noah Harari, who says, "Myths and fictions accustomed people nearly from the moment of birth to think in certain ways, to want certain things, and to observe certain rules. They thereby created artificial instincts that enabled millions of strangers to cooperate effectively. This network of artificial instincts is called culture." And we see that with everything today. We see that with politics, with religion. Everything has been built up by something that someone's told someone, and it's grown into what we now just take for granted. Money, for example.
Yeah, money's a story.
It all is.
A little piece of plastic or metal isn't actually that valuable by itself, but because of the story that we all agree on, now it's valuable, and now we can trade it for food and things like that. So it's a really interesting and cool way for people to connect and build trust in each other through sharing of the same stories.
And I think even on a deeper level, it actually changes the structure of the body, or of the brain tissue. What we are told, and what we hear and listen to shapes who we are.
Yeah. It's the basis of neuroplasticity is, neurons that fire together wire together. So certain stories will change the connections in our brain, and therefore change our behaviors and change our beliefs and all of these flow-on effects from the stories that we are told and the stories that we believe. And
you don't need research to sort of prove it. You only have to think of, we talked about this analogy not too long ago with a child getting told from a very young age that they have all of this potential, and being in a supporting, loving family, compared to a child who doesn't get that exposure, is not given the support and the love and the drive and the inspiration that they need,
or even put down or said, "Oh, you're stupid child," or like you're not smart, or whatever, or they get these narratives that completely go the opposite way.
Yeah, 100%.
And you end up with a completely different person at the end of the day, or after a period of years. Could be the same child, same genes, and with different stories and different environments like that, they end up with two completely different outcomes.
And I think that comes to today, and I guess that brings us to stories in the modern context. The importance of those stories being, and you can question what's truthful and what's not these days, but Frank says he calls them functional stories that have a purpose, I suppose. And the big risk is, the people who are telling the stories these days and the people with the megaphones aren't necessarily telling the stories that we need to hear.
Yeah, true. And he talks about them almost being, is it junk stories he refers? Or
like plastic or synthetic stories.
Yeah.
And we're consumed by them every single day.
Yeah.
You only have to go on social media to see these stories on your feed. And the problem is they look like real stories.
I guess that's interesting. The marketing world has really tapped into the power of story to market things, because that's how people resonate with concepts. But unfortunately, a lot of the things that are being marketed are quite actually anti-health, or they're just, how does he describe it? They're like artificial.
They're like processed foods.
Processed foods, yeah.
So you have that comparison where you could have nutrient-dense foods, which would be healthy narratives, or you can have these synthetic narratives, which are processed food that have been refined, distilled, and stripped of those original nutrients.
And they still hit some of the reward centers of the brain. Like junk food still can taste really good. They hit those reward centers. but are the nutrients actually there and are they actually helping you? Often not with those sort of, those junk stories.
That's exactly right. And I think that's why we really do need healthy narratives these days. Author Alex Evans actually puts it really, really well. In this time of global crisis and transition, mass migration, inequality, resource scarcity, and climate change, it's only by finding new myths, those that speak to us of renewal and restoration, that will navigate our way to a better future. It is stories, rather than facts and pie charts, that have the power to animate us and to bring us together to change the world. And I think that's the idea behind what I'm trying to start with Stories Told, is flipping the script a bit, and using the platform and the power we have to tell stories for good.
I think that's pretty huge, because it is interesting when we're talking about those junk stories, whether or not there's truth in them or not, there's certain stories that sort of grab the attention of the watcher or the listener. And the classic example is a lot of the negativity, I suppose, that is covered in the news, and it's been shown in research that the brain focuses more attention on negative or sort of dangerous concepts or things in the environment than it does on positive, because that has a more sort of immediate effect on your survival. So if there's something dangerous, it wants to focus attention on it. And so media tends to tap into that and show stories that, grab attention, because the media and all social media obviously are in the business of, it's the attention economy.
Eyeballs. Yeah.
They need eyeballs so they can show ads. And I think, whether or not the people in those industries are purposely trying to do that, it's all about the industry that they're in and what generates money, and therefore they tell certain stories. And
I was in that industry. I was in the midst of that industry, and you don't feel like you're complicit. This is the thing. You like to think that you're fighting the good fight, but the very nature of the industry is such that sometimes there's nothing you can personally do. It's just the
fact of it.
Yeah.
And that means a lot of good stories go untold, because they're not attention grabbing enough, maybe, or they're not short enough that people can watch it in a 30-second or 60-second bite. Or maybe if good stories do get told, they don't get told properly, or they don't get the depth that's needed for people to really resonate with them.
Yeah. And I guess to give a bit of context to where I've come from, first of all, I grew up in Brisbane and went to Hilda Road State School, and when I was in grade 1, well, even before that, growing up, we were always a camping family, so we'd go on big camping trips to Fraser or up north to the Cape or out west, and some of my earliest and fondest memories are of sitting around the campfire and listening to people older than me tell stories, and the ones that captivated you the most are the ones that you remember, and it's that art that I really remember so nostalgically, that early style of storytelling, and you would have been the same.
100%. Yeah, we had one Uncle Angus who was particularly good at storytelling, and Max had some exposure to his stories lately, and so he's still a great storyteller, but
one of the best.
Very, very strong memories of all of me and all my young cousins when we were all young, gathering around and just begging Angus to tell us a story, and even stories that we'd heard 2, 3, 4, 5 times before. We'd say, "Oh, can you tell us that story again?" And it would almost be like he was telling it for the first time, and you'd just be transported into this different world of like imagination, and he would have the craziest stories of things that we would probably never do in our childhood. He sort of grew up in a different time in a different area, and so he had a lot of very cool, interesting, funny stories. But we were just captivated by it, and we'd always want more.
And I think you would always want more, but I caught the bug really young of being able to be the sharer of stories, to be the storyteller. When I was in grade 1, I did my first public speaking competition, and essentially that's just telling a story to a big group of people, I caught that bug, that thrill of getting the reception of people, not, I guess, the applause, but it was being able to have people hanging on, captivated that whole time, absolutely transfixed by what you're saying. And, that was when I was 6. And for every year since then, I did the public speaking competition and went to Sydney for a public speaking comp, and, ended up doing debating when I was in high school, a different type of storytelling, but still trying to change minds by the words that you're using. And yeah, it was through that journey and my love of the written word that I started studying journalism. And to be brutally honest, when I started studying journalism, I had no idea what journalism was, or no real idea. I'd watched the news, obviously, but didn't know what it entailed. And I think I'm just so fortunate that, with my mum, who suggested, thank you, Mum, that I do journalism. I think I was just very fortunate that I found it and it was the perfect fit because...
Yeah, you've actually, one of my earliest memories of you, we met playing soccer actually in grade 7, and then grade 8 we ended up at the same high school, and I think it was the first day of grade 8 or maybe the second day, and you got up and gave this speech for getting into the student advisory council and the SAC, and he would say, vote for Mac in this year's SAC. And
quite ballsy for
for the first day of grade 8. But everyone was, first of all, captivated by the speech, and then just in hysterical laughter. And I was like, wow, this guy can speak.
Yeah, and I think you're 100% right. Like, going and studying journalism and going through that journey, and then being lucky enough to get a job with Channel 7 before I'd even finished the degree, and I had 6 months to go, and I was freaking out, and managed to secure a role in Cairns, and flew myself up at the age of 19 after I'd lived at home up until that point, and moved out of home and took on this brave new world of journalism as a 19-year-old. And
another ballsy move.
Yeah, and I was very naive to what it all involved, and potentially not ready for what, again, not having that perspective of the power of storytelling. We're taught how to do it at uni, and I had a very, very fortunate university experience, some really great role models, but the power of storytelling, whether we were taught it or not, is something that I just didn't quite grasp. And it wasn't until I got into Cairns, a township, a smaller city, and you start to interact with people, and you start to meet the locals and the local identities, and you become a part of this community. And then you see the power of your stories. There was 4 of us putting together a half-an-hour bulletin every night with local stories about local people, and people really connected with it. You'd see it on the Facebook comments once you'd put the story up online. And it's the stories, and that's where I really learnt, I think, the power of really localizing that content, because people don't necessarily care about what Donald Trump's got to say, but they do care about what their neighbours got to say, because they can relate to it. And yeah, I think over the next 7 years, I went from Cairns to the Sunshine Coast, and then down to the Gold Coast, and those 4 years were what shaped me as the reporter I am. And I like to think that throughout all of that, I've always had a strong moral compass to make sure that the people I'm including in my stories are given a fair say and a fair go, and I put their interests first as much as possible. Sometimes that can't be helped, but as much as possible, I wanted to go home at night and know that I hadn't screwed someone over for the sake of a story. But on the flip side, I think what I did neglect over those years was the viewers at home sometimes. While I was looking out for the people I was interviewing, sometimes the stories that were going to air weren't necessarily in the best interests of the public. And that just comes with, and that came with the role that I was in as a reporter for a commercial news broadcaster, and I have loved that experience. Don't get me wrong. It and I believe that it is such a powerful platform, the news, and I think it was just interesting. It's only been in the last year or so that I've had that new perspective on where my role could fit into journalism and how I could use those skills that I've gained over the last 5 years to tell stories in a way that really aligns with with my beliefs.
Yeah, because having that freedom is pretty key to tell the stories that you want to be able to tell. And even though, like, obviously you enjoyed your time with the role you were in, you were, especially being in the crime role, you were sort of limited to a certain type of story. Different stories every day, obviously, but, around crime and what's happening, who got stabbed or who got shot or who...
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. It was, and I did that for 4 years, the crime role, 2 years on the Gold Coast and 2 years up here in Brisbane when I moved back a few years ago. And it's taxing, but it gives you a very narrow perspective of society. And there may be a stabbing in Caboolture one day, but that is probably the worst thing that's happened in the entire state, and it makes the news. And it's not a fair representation, I feel, sometimes on everything else that's going on in the state. And on the flip side, people need to be informed, and this is always the
catch-22.
This is the catch-22 that you always have in that role. Is people do need to know this, but how much do they need to know, and how much weight needs to be given to what we're telling them?
Yeah, or does someone in Brisbane need to know that someone in Cairns got stabbed, or how much does it affect them besides sort of raising their blood pressure and making them upset? And
then on the flip side, you can argue that they do have a right to know and they need to know, and then people are angry when they don't get told. And this was a constant struggle I had in that role. But I think after 4 years in that role and 7 years as a journalist, I got to the stage where I needed a break, and that sort of all aligned with where we are now. I mean, I moved back to Brisbane 3 years ago, and serendipitously, you were ready to move out of home, and I needed a place to live, so we found ourselves here in Auchenflower, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, and that was when I was starting a new business venture with the Foot Collective. And so I was working as a physiotherapist, contracting at the St. Andrew's Hospital with a neurosurgeon called David Johnson, who was running some very cool movement programs for people with back pain, basically teaching them how to, lift things and squat and row and basically functional movements to help bring some function back to these people who are in a very chronic cycle of pain. And that was a really, really interesting experience, actually. And I can see, looking back, I can see how the stories of, throughout my, education as a physiotherapy student, and then throughout my career, the different stories that I've been told and different stories that I've believed have really shaped how I view the world and how I would practice as a physio. And it's fascinating to look at it through that lens of story.
And health is a realm where there are a lot of stories flying around, and everyone thinks their story is right. Yeah,
and so a really interesting thing. I started studying physiotherapy, and there's the traditional academic university story, I suppose, of health, which is tends to be very, reductionist, or they teach you the very nitty-gritty, grainy of human biology and anatomy and physiology, and which is all very, very important stuff to know as a health professional. And then they teach you all the different ways that things can go wrong in each body part, and they sort of talk about why it goes wrong. I feel like they miss certain parts, but they mostly focused on what goes wrong, how do you diagnose it, and how do you treat it or manage the symptoms of that issue. And
really reactive.
Yeah, quite reactive, exactly. And so there's that story, and throughout in first year physio, I was driving a lot to get to uni, and so I was like, oh, what am I going to do while I drive? And so I just started listening to podcasts. I think my mum sort of said, oh, there's this, I think it was about that time that podcasts really started to boom, and so I started just listening to a heap of health podcasts. Stories, yeah, people's stories, people who've written books, who've studied a certain topic for years and years and years, and now they've, wrapped all that up into a story of their life or their research or their experience, and they get it across in a podcast. And I just found that so valuable because there was a whole heap of these different perspectives that I wasn't being exposed to at all at uni through the traditional approach. And I could see how those perspectives matched up with what I was learning in terms of the human physiology, and started to sort of make sense of the world and the body and health. And that was a very interesting experience. And I did start learning a lot about the sort of ancestral health concept, about how our body and our genes, our DNA expects certain conditions and behaviors, and will really thrive under those certain conditions, mostly more of a natural context, natural food, natural movement, natural sleep, so to speak, and so on. And started to learn a lot about that, and started getting very interested in nutrition and the movement side of things, and realized that while learning about all these dysfunctions in the body, I was sitting down and studying with my head down in these books and actually being very sedentary and actually stiffening up my whole body and making it more prone to injury. And I thought that was an interesting paradox, and I started to really delve into what movement practices I could explore to unwind those quote unquote dysfunctions in my body, and to get more limber and more just graceful with my movement, and to free up that stiffness. And
to be honest, I mean, I don't mean to butt in, but that is such a parallel to where I was at once I'd made the decision to leave and start Stories Told, knowing that that's what I wanted to be doing, and having that paradox of, not being able to tell every day the stories that I wanted to be telling the way I wanted to be telling them. It was that stiffness. It was that,
interesting,
that rigidness of just
more psychological stiffness.
Yeah.
And then you go, there's another option. There's a more freedom option.
Yeah, exactly.
that I can explore. Yeah, that's pretty huge.
Yeah.
And experiencing that, and then I started through the ancestral health things. I actually started to be like, why am I wearing shoes that aren't foot shaped? I think I heard about it on a podcast somewhere. And so I ended up getting a pair of the Vibram toe shoes, those like 5-finger shoes, which...
And everyone laughed.
And everyone laughed. And it's funny actually how much of a response you can get from those toe shoes when they actually just look like feet. And it just goes to show,
bizarre.
like, you could wear a glove on your hands and it be thin and hand-shaped with fingers, and that looks completely normal. And people go, well, of course you'd wear a glove like that because it's functional and allows your hand to function. But if you suddenly wear a shoe that it's foot-shaped and has the toes showing, then...
And that all comes down to the synthetic stories that we're talking about before.
Exactly.
The stories that we've been told about shoes, that they need to be stylish,
or that they need to be supportive, that the story about your feet, that they're inherently weak and fragile and they need support and they need cushioning, and otherwise they're going to break down and hurt. And paradoxically, the more you support the foot, well, not paradoxically, actually it's pretty intuitive, the more you support the foot, the less movement your foot has to do, and the weaker and stiffer it gets.
And really that was, once you'd heard that story, the one that I guess you ran with.
That stuck. And that was actually that was in my sort of second or third year of physio. And I remember, rocking up to one mate, Charles, had the 5 fingers as well. So I was like, oh, cool, I've got a mate. And so I rocked up to uni with the 5 fingers and got a few laughs and so on. And anyway, I didn't actually take that much further, because in uni we're sort of taught to leave the foot stuff to podiatrists. But I just thought, well, I'm going to wear shoes that are foot shaped, and I got a pair that, were wide and flexible and so on, but didn't actually have the toes as well. And so that sort of ticked along in the back of my mind, like, this makes sense to wear these kind of shoes, but I wasn't sort of preaching it too much to everyone. And and then I ended up getting, in my fourth year of physio, I was doing a lot of practical placements. We'd sort of finished up our theory study, and I was doing practical placements in like neurological rehab and pediatrics and cardiovascular in the hospital, like cardiopulmonary rehab and things like that. And my last one was my musculoskeletal placement. And I just remember being quite, I guess the word maybe is disenfranchised, or just concerned that I'd just spent a whole 4 years studying this degree and realizing that it's so hard to help people within the context of traditional physio, because you're seeing someone for an hour.
It's almost too late as well.
I wouldn't say too late, but people are so attached to their stories of why they've got a certain pain, and the medical system really does promote certain stories that are structurally based, like, oh, you've got a slip disc, or a bulging disc, and that's why you're in pain, or you've got knee osteoarthritis and that's why you're in pain, and all these things that are actually quite hard to change short of surgery. And so if someone gets told this story and they're not getting a surgery, then they go, well, I'm just going to be in pain, forever, and I just have to manage it with pain medication, or with physio for massage and things like that. And I really just did not like the idea of managing people's symptoms and keeping seeing them, week
just
after week, just to help them get by, and give them these exercises to do that they wouldn't really do because they're boring, and they didn't really get how it was going to help. And, maybe they just wanted a surgery, or they just wanted, a more of a quick fix, which again is a part of the cultural story, that there are fixes out there that someone can do to you. And interestingly enough, in my first job after physio school, I was like, oh, am I even going to be a physio? But I came across this physio clinic that were doing things quite differently, and it was a new story for me. It was like, oh, there's a neurophysiological approach to a whole body approach that looks at, it's not just the area of symptoms, it's like what else is going on in the body that could be contributing. But interestingly enough, in that role, the story was also that us physios were the ones that were fixing clients' problems, and then that client would then have the chance to stay fixed through some changes to their movement behavior and their posture, largely focused on posture, but also, dynamic posture through movement.
Seeing the practitioner as the key to the rest of their lives, rather than them being the
driver of their rehab. And certainly I was able to get some amazing results. As a first year physio, I was blown away at what I could do in terms of, because this approach was very effective with manual therapy. You can do amazing things with symptoms with manual therapy, and obviously that's context dependent. Some people don't respond well, but a lot of people respond amazingly well. Even with many, many years of chronic pain, if you find the right areas of the body to treat, then you can get some amazing symptom relief. And that does give a window of opportunity, if you want to call it that, to change some movement behaviors that will help. But the narrative was, we fix you, you stay fixed, but keep seeing us so that we can help you stay fixed. And I certainly think there's a large role for accountability and progression in rehab, and to see a professional regularly, almost as preventative, really. And that does make a lot of sense to me. I suppose what I really didn't resonate with was, I'm fixing someone. Especially I started to then read more books, one of which was Katie Bowman, and we did a whole podcast on her concept of movement nutrition, and I realized that it's not me fixing someone at all. It's someone quote unquote fixing themselves through lifestyle and behavior change, and that went even deeper than postural change. Like, oh, I'm going to sit at my desk differently, or I'm going to stand at my desk differently. It's like
a belief change.
Yeah, it's more, I'm going to move more throughout the day, because movement is like nutrition, and we need the right amount, we need the right quality, and we need the right variety. And so that was really paradigm shifting for me. And then I ended up in a different role with Dave Johnson at the hospital, and I was getting a lot more into movement and learning a lot more about movement training and coaching, and again, seeing amazing results with back pain, very, very severe and persistent back pain. People who were at their wits' end and seeing a surgeon for it. And I really liked his approach of avoiding surgery really at all costs, in order to empower the patient with movement. And, that was, I guess, the very opposite story to what I had been. It was they're fixing themselves. We're just coaching them through the things to fix themselves. And so I did really enjoy my time there, and I learnt a lot. And about I think a year into that, I started getting more into the barefoot thing. And so I read another book by Katie Bowman called Whole Body Barefoot. And also my mate, James, told me about the Foot Collective on Instagram. And he said, oh, you probably like what these guys are doing. And that was when I realized, oh, there's a whole community and philosophy around this stuff that goes even deeper than just footwear. And I would see them playing on balance beams, and really understood how that would affect the feet and the ankles and the hips and the balance in general. And I started thinking, wow, so yeah, being barefoot gives you a better connection to the ground, which gives you better sensory input, which therefore should give you better movement output. And so I just with that lens, I was looking at these back pain patients coming into our programs. We do group programs. And they're all wearing these thick, really thick cushioned supportive shoes with orthotics in them for, a lot. And I'm trying to teach them how to hip hinge and how to deadlift and how to squat. And they are just wobbling all over the place, really struggling to...
It's almost like you go back to that analogy, or the history of how the tribe started telling stories. It's almost like you found this tribe of people who were telling stories that you finally believed in, and that, again, you were going then, and that when you were seeing your patients, it was like, okay, now I can get to hunt for myself.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, well, I'm going to try just asking these people to take their shoes off, and all of a sudden they could learn the movements a lot easier, and they could connect with their whole body far easier when they actually had a proper connection to the ground. And that really gave me a lot of confidence of, I feel like I need to make a change in this culture and in this story of feet need big cushioned supportive shoes and orthotics in order to be healthy, because it just doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary point of view, from a human physiological point of view. The feet are just like any other part of the body. They can be strong and mobile and adaptive by themselves, and probably even more so than other parts of the body because
of their constant exposure to load.
Yeah, historically they're our main connection with the earth, and they would be stepping on all kinds of different textures and surfaces and things like that would really challenge them. And yeah, so physiologically, I just thought, well, feet need load, and they need texture, and they need to be out of these shoes, these sort of quote unquote foot coffins.
And to give a bit of context to people who don't know what the Foot Collective is, it was started by a bloke in Canada. Can you sort of explain what it is and what Nick St. Louis, the guy who started it over there, was sort of trying to achieve and was achieving?
Yeah, so Nick is a physio over there in Canada, and I guess he had a similar realization where he was seeing a lot of patients with foot pain at his physio clinic, or foot pain, or just any other kind of pain, and I think he'd read similar books and just started telling people, let's try going barefoot and changing your foot function and working on your hip stability with these balance beams, and found really great results. So he just started a an Instagram account to sort of document that and put out some helpful information about those concepts. He certainly isn't the inventor of all of those concepts. He's just learnt a lot through the people that he's read and listened to and so on. But I think what's really awesome about he called it the Foot Collective because he wanted to start a movement and a tribe of practitioners and, you know, movement enthusiasts, or just tribe of people who were on that same wavelength and could share all of their knowledge together as a collective. And
I guess then fast forward to when you connected with him. Where was he at, and what did you ask?
so he was at the point where he was just about to launch the Foot Nerd program, which is his way of developing that sort of inner community of people who were of that same mindset and who were committed to, I guess, their own health process and their own movement process, and also keen to help other people do the same thing. And so he was just at that point, and I was like, hey, I want to buy a balance beam from you because they look really fun, and I want to get your beam training system. And unfortunately, he couldn't ship me one because they're just way too expensive to ship. And so I started I started just playing on some random like pull-up rigs and things like that. And then my mate Mitch, who was also a physio who liked the concepts, he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll be able to get one of these made." And so we got one of them made. And then the more I played on it, the more powerful I realized it was, and the more fun I had. And I was like, this is a really cool product and a really cool philosophy. Like, I really want to be a part of spreading this. And so I just asked Nick, is there someone in Australia, or can I be the dude in Australia who helps distribute these products? Because if you can't ship them over, then I can make them here. And can I be a part of the Foot Nerd program and start running the workshops and things like that down here?
And that was at the point that I really moved in. I was, just got the job up in Brizzy with Channel 7 and moved the life on up and moved into this apartment we're sitting in. And I still remember, I guess, the first time I saw the beam for myself, and it was quite a foreign thing for me to see, and I guess for myself, for those 4 or 5 years leading up to that, when I left uni and gone into work, a big focus of my life had been career. And, we'd stayed in touch and we'd seen each other throughout the years. And it wasn't until we started living together that I really started to change it changed my complete perspective on health, and putting that first.
Yeah. And like we were saying, now you started to get exposed to a different story because of the stories that I had started to read and believe. And then you would go, okay, that actually kind of makes sense. Maybe I should start looking at switching my shoes or doing a bit more movement, or, things like it was quite gradual. But
It was. And look, to be honest, it's because I'd been hearing different stories all my life, and was probably too consumed in my own story to let it all in. I just thought, oh yeah, good on you, mate. Like, cool. That's
cool. That's
good
fun.
On you. Yeah, sweet. You're selling beams. Great. Like, that's cool. How weird people are buying these things. But awesome. I'd played soccer all my life and had been very, very fortunate never to have any injuries, touch wood. But, I think it was seeing your own journey with injury that really opened my eyes to the fact that I didn't want to get injured, and then also the benefits of your approach to health and the feet.
That's right, actually, because when we were moving in together, I had this chronic knee pain. I'd already had it for the last year or so, year and a half probably. And then we moved in, and you'd be like, oh, do you want to come play futsal with me, or do you want to come play soccer, or do you want to just go for a muck around in the park? And I'd be like, oh, sorry, man, like my knees will flare up. And I remember that being a little confusing for you, like, oh, like they're that bad? Like you can't even come down.
I couldn't grasp it, especially because I'd always seen you as, a pillar of, physical strength and fitness, because that's just what you'd always been, a mover.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that you could have it, a debilitating injury that.
These old man knees.
Yeah, pretty much.
And I mean,
and I saw what it did to you, mentally as well.
Yeah, it was pretty tough. Yeah, and it was a long journey, and I'll probably explore all that in another podcast because it's quite a long story in itself. But yeah, it was a lot of work in order to reverse that. I guess that gave me even more belief in the story that you can sort of fix yourself through the right training. But at the same time, what made the biggest difference was me getting some guidance from another professional, because for that year and a half, I was like, I'm a physio, I can fix this myself. I can, I know what to do. And then just kept running into barriers and walls. And it wasn't until I started paying someone to do my programming for me, to look at how I was moving and to sort of give me that guidance, that I really started to change and improve. And now that's become a big part of my story as well. I was debilitated for a couple of years. I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do. I couldn't play. And that really took its toll on my mental health and my physical health as well. And fast forward to now, I'm through all of that, and I can do anything I want, pretty much. Yeah,
and I guess that sort of brings us to where TFC is today, the Foot Collective. So 3 years later, after starting it, it's now at the stage where, I guess we'll take you back to, what would it have been, 4 or 5 months ago now. It was on my birthday weekend, actually, that, after years of living with you and being exposed to that story and seeing my own health habits change, I was a big drinker when I was younger, and that was just the culture that I was exposed to.
Me too.
Yeah,
Uni days we drank a fair bit.
Yeah,
it's Aussie culture, really.
It really is. But after almost 2020 was the driest year I've ever had, and I'd made it my commitment that I didn't want to work a day hungover, and trust me, there've been plenty of those days before 2020. But yeah, just those little baby steps that I'd made in my own health journey, even ditching the RM Williams and wearing shoes that actually were good for my feet. All of these little things started to build up, I think, the story in my mind, and that real juxtaposition between the life I was having to live and the life I wanted to be living. And it's a taxing job. You're up at 5 a.m. making calls to police, and you're finishing work at 6:30 at night, and it doesn't leave you much room to look after yourself. And I think it's once I realized that I wanted to shift from a career focus to a focus on just living life and living a healthy life, and then making everything else fit around that, it all sort of started to align.
And at the same time, I was in an interesting mode where I felt overwhelmed by what I was doing, and I also felt like things were quite impersonal, because I'd gone from practicing physio one-on-one with people and seeing results to sort of, like, I believed in the power of the beams and the power of the culture that we were trying to develop, but then it ended up where a lot of my time was spent on the logistics of product fulfillment, shipping, packaging, supply chains, and all of these things that are obviously foundational to a business, and were part of me getting the service and the message out there, but also became quite overwhelming. And our apartment was always full of various knickknacks, beams and toe spreaders and so on. And I think you were quite gracious in sort of helping me out with some of that stuff along the way and everything. And I'm certainly so grateful for anyone who's supported us with those product purchases. But I realized that I needed help, or I needed a change. And also at the same time, I was really struggling to tell my story through social media and to make the impact that I wanted to make through that education side of things, and getting more creative content out there, because I just felt like I was too stressed and under the pump. And I also had a story that I was bad at social media.
And there's so many parallels with what you were going through at the same time as what I was going through, because in 2020, with all of the negativity that that year brought, and COVID was a big part of that, and there were just a lot of negative stories that were circling around, and it wasn't until it was actually really at the height of COVID, as the fear was settling in, that I met a bloke at the shops called Mike, who had pulled up on his trike. It was when the elderly shopping hour had started, and I'd been sent on a mission to go do a story about the elderly shopping hour and this 1 hour period where people could get in and get out to get their groceries because the panic buying had gone crazy, and it was just too chaotic for elderly people to shop, and for the disabled as well. And that's why Mike was there. He'd ridden on his trike from West End to Newmarket, and we saw him sitting outside the shops, me and Lindsay, the cameraman, that morning. And, we got a shot of him before he went in. And as he rolled out of the supermarket with his trike full of groceries, I just stopped him, and he stopped and said g'day and had a chat. And yeah, he just said that all of these groceries that he'd bought weren't actually for him. They were for his best mate, Pete, who lived up the road in Windsor. And he'd gone there nice and early to make sure that he could get the groceries for his mate Pete because he was sick, and he didn't want to take the risk of his mate Pete getting sick, because if he gets too sick, he'd die. He had heart conditions, and he was, just not in a good way, and just not in a position to go and do the shopping for himself. So Mike had ridden all this way to go do that for him, and this story that was meant to be about panic buying and the elderly shopping hour and what supermarkets are doing, and this real clinical story ended up, that all got pushed to the side, and it was a story about a bloke he was a double, I didn't even say, but Mike's a double amputee. That gives context to why he was on the trike. So the fact that this bloke with no legs had ridden all this way for his mate, just to bring him the groceries, and was so kind and so open and so welcoming and so grateful for the story that we ended up putting on air that night.
And that blew up, didn't it?
It blew up, and
people loved it.
It got, and that was it. And I'd always known that those stories resonated, but it wasn't until that one went as viral as it did. And
I think it was because it was such a juxtaposition to the whole negative.
It's what the world,
the negative news.
It's what
that
Australia
was
needed right then. He was the person people needed to hear from. They didn't want to hear from Scott Morrison anymore, or
how many deaths
from
there were
Jeanette
now,
Young and the chief health officer, and they didn't want to hear that. They wanted to hear some positivity, and that's what Mike gave them. Yeah. And so, going back to what you were saying about this struggle, is that I knew that from that point, that's the stories I wanted to be telling. That's the stories that fulfilled me. But then being dragged back into this state where I again was having to go through the mundane everyday stories, all of the different COVID stories that we were having to do day in, day out, became very draining. But I knew that my urge was to tell these positive stories, because not only did it make me feel good, but I knew that it made those people feel good. And we went back to Mike the day after we told that story, to do a follow-up, because it had gone viral. And to be honest, I had purposefully not gotten his number the day before, because I had a feeling that it would go viral, his story, and then I had a feeling that the producers would then ask me to go and do the follow-up story. And I thought, look, I just don't want to, this guy's been so kind and so open and so honest, both him and Pete, and I was like, I just don't want to drag them into the media circle again for the sake of another story. And to be fair, while I was a little reluctant when I got asked to go and chase him up and get his reaction to the fact that he was now this viral superstar on social media, I'm very glad I did, because I managed to track him down at his West End apartment, and then was able to show him the comments that people had left on that story that we'd done the night before. And of course, Mike didn't have Facebook, so he hadn't seen it. And he broke down in tears as we were reading him these comments from people saying how inspired they were, and what a great bloke he was. And this is a double amputee who lives in a housing commission apartment, with no legs, who used to be a school teacher, and has just had a real rough trot. And for him to hear those words from other people made his day, made his year. He was so proud and so humbled And he said in that story, all I was doing was helping out a mate. He didn't get why people were so attracted or so moved by that. But it's that positive story, that healthy narrative. That, again, helped lift spirits. And that shows the power of story, I think.
For sure.
That story probably got more views than any other COVID story that we did over those months. And I think that in itself is, for me, was a sign of what I knew I needed to do, but what I wasn't able to do for months and months. And then I guess it was, like you said, your struggle to feel like you couldn't communicate your story. And I could see that there was a story there that needed to be told. The TFC story, I believed in it now. It was, it was running through my veins, and I completely aligned with what you were saying. And, I was living and breathing it. And it was sort of this realization that, well, you need a storyteller. You've got a story. Why don't we combine forces?
Yeah. And the podcast is just a perfect platform for us to do that in a way that also gets across a lot of our philosophy and what we're trying to achieve. And it's very exciting. And it's also a lot more fun to be working with another person, especially when they're your best mate.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. 100%. It doesn't feel like work, any of it. And especially because it's got that purpose behind everything we're doing. And so, essentially I've come on as a director with TFC, and it's exciting to see where that journey takes us. And I can't wait to share your story, our story, the stories of all of the people in the tribe, in the TFC community, because there are some incredible people out there doing some incredible things.
Oh, yeah.
And then on the other hand, Stories Told gives me a perfect platform to share those stories, but also to share stories of other incredible people doing incredible things.
Yeah, because it's all interrelated. Like, you can't separate foot health from whole body health, and you can't separate whole body health from environmental health. And so some of the stories you've already done are amazing examples of how people are working to restore that harmony between our human bodies and nature and movement and all of these awesome things. And I love the symbiotic nature of it all.
Yeah. And so I guess that is where we get to Stories Told and how it was born. And I was trying to think before this podcast how it actually was when it did start, because it was sort of a gradual progression. But I actually think it probably was from that meeting with Mike, and then the weeks and months after that of not being able to tell those stories every day, but knowing that that's what fulfilled me and that's what gave me purpose, that I wanted to find a way to do that. And so Stories Told was born as an idea of creating a platform where I could build a community of people who shared this love for positive news. And I'd seen through those stories that there was a market for it. People wanted to hear positive stuff. And especially if it was told right and given the time and the pause and the impact that those stories deserved. And so I started plugging away at this idea. And again, the struggle with these things is that you have to make money to live. And that is the tough part, being a journalist who doesn't get paid for stories. And it's drilled into you that you have to have these ethics of, no payment for stories, and you want to remain objective. But I overcame that by just thinking that, well, look, if I have faith in my own moral compass and I treat that to every single story I approach and make sure that the brands and the businesses that I believe in are ones that I'm working with, and you don't go for a cash grab for the sake of a cash grab, and you don't run a story just because someone's willing to pay big bucks, then I don't think that I'll ever have any issue with that.
It's a win-win because the world gets a lot of value from hearing those stories. The people whose stories are being told get a lot of value because they get great exposure to a like-minded community. And it is very symbiotic in that way. And I think it's an amazing idea. Maybe a little bit biased, but it is. We were saying that it's interesting that no one's already doing that, but it obviously has a big potential to grow.
And that is something that's really surprised me, actually, is just the fact that people have been telling news stories for years. And I guess people are doing it to a degree.
True.
There are people telling, I guess what we're doing are mini documentaries on humans. But yeah, it's taking what the news does so well, which is find these incredible stories and unearth them and tell them, give them the time that they're worth, essentially, and create a platform that's not muddied with all of the other negativity that swirls around in the news sphere. Because my fellow journalists and colleagues, ex-colleagues from Seven, they do incredible stories and they meet incredible people and they do tell good news. And I think that's something that people forget, is people look at the top 2-3 stories and think, the news is so doom and gloom. And they don't wait until half an hour in to get that feel-good story. They are being told, but with Stories Told, I want to create a platform where that's all you get.
You can just go onto Stories Told and you go, cool, I've got X amount of stories to watch and they're all going to make me feel good and they're all going to be, centered around, something positive in the world.
Exactly. And you will have seen the Sporting Wheelies story that's already broadcast, that's already been premiered, but really excited about next week's piece with Habitat Matt. He's a very inspiring dude, Matt Keys, but the way it works is we'll premiere a story every single week. That's the plan anyways, as long as the clients come in. But yeah, we've got a backlog of stories ready to tell, and you'll get a taste for what we're trying to achieve. There'll be, impactful stories, moving visual narratives, I hope, that don't just promote a business, but promote ideas and values and philosophies that can hopefully, through better stories, shape a better future. Is what we're trying to achieve. Look, if you guys have a story out there that you think needs to be told, please get in touch, because I don't want a story to go untold because people don't think it's financially viable. If it's worth telling, I hope we can find a way to tell it.
Yeah, it's always worth a chat.
That's it. Give us a call. And please send us messages and comment on the stories to let us know what you think, and give
share
them a share.
Around.
Yeah, give them a share, because I think we need to spread that positivity as much as possible. And
that's where the power of social media is amazing. Is yes, it can be a lot about attention grabbing and all of this, but you can really share stuff far and wide. And if it's good stuff and it impacts people in a positive way, then that's a lot of power. With the power of the internet.
Power of the internet and the power of stories.
And the power of story, exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us for the first episode. The next episode will be with Habitat Matt Keys. So make sure you catch his story on the Stories Told Facebook page, Instagram or YouTube. Give us a follow, and we can't wait to share the next one with you.